Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight, I am joined by Coach Redpill and Keith Preston. We're here to discuss the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, which happened on November 6th. Just FYI, the reason why in the West we call it the October Revolution, even though it's November, the Russians were using the old Julian calendar, which was, I think, about a month behind the Western Gregorian calendar, which is why we call it October. We call it November. They call it October. But to sketch out the brief few months of the Russian Revolution from February to October, we have Coach Redpill. So why don't you explain to us, Coach, what happened in February of 1917, and how did that lead up to the events in October?
Sure. Well, first of all, Todd, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure being here to discuss this issue, which I think is really important. And now that it's been 100 years since the October Revolution, I think it's worthwhile to talk about it because, the 100 years, the period of the Soviet Union proved to be traumatic for Russia and for the rest of the world, quite frankly. And I think that especially considering how Antifa and other groups, radical leftist groups, and even some old-style communists are coming back, I think it's wise to recall the period of the Russian Revolution and recall what happened because of the Russian Revolution. Now, to get started, it's very simple. You have to understand that there were two revolutions, not one. They both happened in 1917. This is essentially what happened. In February of 1917, the Tsar, that is the king, the king of Russia, the Tsar, he was deposed. He was deposed in a fairly bloodless coup. His government simply fell for various reasons that we'll get into in just a moment. And so there was the February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar. During the next, 9 months, there were a succession of what became known as the provisional governments. They were, in fact, 4 different governments. And the way you can demarcate each of these 4 governments is that at each juncture, there was a reshuffling of the cabinet. At first, in the first 2 provisional governments, there were 4, as I said. In the first 2, they were led by Prince Lvov. In the second 2, they were led by Alexander Kerensky, who was a socialist. Now, Prince Lvov was nominally apolitical, I believe, but he was, in fact, sympathetic to what were known as the Cadets, the Constitutional Democrats. Now, you have to understand that both the Cadets and the Kerensky wing of the socialists, what they wanted to do was to basically create a kind of representative monarchy. They wanted to bring the Tsar back, but without any power. They wanted to replicate something along the lines of the British monarchy. Because do keep in mind that the British monarch had actual executive authority late 18th century, but during all of the 19th century, that executive authority had been eroded under Victoria by William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli and other prime ministers, until by the beginning of the 20th century, the King of England really didn't have any kind of executive authority. He was, for all intents and purposes, a figurehead. Although a very respected figurehead, he was, the head of state, but without any real power. The Constitutional Democrats and the moderate socialists wanted to replicate that because at a popular level, the Tsar was extremely popular in terms of the proletariat. Sorry for using the Marxist terminology. He was extremely popular, and people wanted the sense of security that a monarch could give them. Now, do keep in mind, we today, 100 years after the fact, we have a hard time understanding the realities of Russia at that time. You have to understand there were only basically 2 cities in Russia. There was Moscow and there was Petrograd. Petrograd, modern St. Petersburg. Now, Petrograd was at that time the capital. Now, these were small cities. You have to keep in mind that 90% of the population of Russia lived in small towns and villages. They were farmers. It was an agricultural country. There was not the industrialization that would come much later, with the large cities that would come much later. Petrograd and Moscow were each what we would consider today to be, third-tier cities, if not merely towns, all right? So that has to be understood in order to get a sense of what was going
on. Looks like you might have frozen up.
Was when the, I beg your pardon?
You froze up for a moment. You might want to repeat yourself for the past 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. I'm sorry about that. What I meant to say was that, you see, between February and October, the provisional governments tried to create this constitutional monarchy, and they failed for a variety of reasons that we'll get into in just a moment. But what's important is to understand that public discontent started to increase, culminating in what became known as the July days. And then slowly it started to peter out a little bit until October. Public discontent was going down in October, but it was the Bolsheviks that were able to create the conditions for a coup d'etat, because what had happened was that the provisional governments had lost the confidence of the people and of the other political sectors. There was not a sense that the provisional governments would actually be able to lead the country out of the political morass that it was currently engaged in. And also, there was the fear that the provisional governments did not truly want to withdraw from the First World War, because you have to keep in mind, the overthrow of the Tsar was really about the First World War, which had been a disastrous decision for Russia. It had cost it, in terms of treasure and in terms of lives, it had been not quite catastrophic as the Second World War. Well, frankly, not even near the Second World War's human and financial cost. But at that time, it was a cost that the Russian people were simply not willing to bear, because also there was a sense that what was Russia getting involved in this war for? It was unclear to the Russian people and to the Russian elites why Russia was involved in this war that seemed a war of aristocrats, but not a war that mattered to the Russian people. And so there was a lot of discontent, and that's what had led to the February Revolution. And the provisional governments failed because there was a sense that they wanted to continue in the war. Some secret cables emerged that tended to show that the provisional governments were being two-faced, saying to the people that they were going to withdraw and end the war. And on the other hand, these secret cables seemed to assure the Allies that Russia would continue with the war effort against Imperial Germany. Now, so the October Revolution, when it happened, what happened was that the Bolsheviks, they used the how do you call it, the military revolutionary committees of the Soviets to essentially take power. Now, what does this mean? Let me unpack it very simply. What happened was that, see, the Soviets were the local committees, like there were democratic committees that were in charge of the different geographic sectors of the country. Okay, because this had been part of what the provisional governments, in point of fact, had tried to do, is to devolve power to the localities. And by devolving power to the localities, they had given power to the Soviets, which were these local committees. Think of the Soviets as sort of like, just to make it simple to understand, sort of like the town councilmen in a small New England town, okay, or a New England county. Sort of like the councilmen who were very responsive to the local, to the people there, and yet they were the elected representatives. So these Soviets were sort of like these little committees that were born after the February Revolution. And there was the direct sense of sort of like a direct democracy, because you have to keep in mind that the people were more and more educated in Russia, and yet the government of the Tsar had been very unresponsive to the people. Now, because of this unresponsiveness, when the Tsar finally fell, the people were very hungry for a direct kind of democracy, which is, of course, human nature. I mean, if you're never allowed to touch the steering wheel, when you finally have a chance to it, you hold on to it with both hands and you steer all over the place because you finally have that freedom, right? And so the Soviets were the expression of the popular will. But the Bolsheviks did something very clever. They made it a point to create these military revolutionary committees, which were tasked with preserving and defending the Soviets. The word Soviet means committee. Okay, Now, these Soviets, these local committees, governing councils, if you will, now they did not have any kind of direct protection from anybody. And so the Bolsheviks had suggested this military revolutionary committee, especially for the ones in Moscow and Petrograd. And they very cleverly, under Trotsky's direction, positioned themselves to control these military revolutionary committees. Now, this would prove crucial because in October, what happened was that these military revolutionary committees were the arms, the military arms that the Bolsheviks used to take control, to take power. Because one thing that you have to understand, the Bolsheviks were just one more party. They were considered the violent, extremist, left-wing party. But they were not a majority. They had a small fraction of support among the population. Most people in Russia thought that the Bolsheviks were crazy because they were violent, and they had proven themselves to be very violent in the so-called July days. The July days were a period of unrest that lasted only a few days, about 4 or 5 days, right around the 4th of July. I think it was, if memory serves me correct, it was between like the 3rd and 7th of July, something like that. 3rd or 8th, I forget, it doesn't matter. The point is, the July days had been a period of popular unrest that, this cable, the secret cables to the Allies had been revealed at this time. And so there was a whole bunch of, there was a lot of popular unrest, and that had been much angrier than the February Revolution. And this popular anger, the Bolsheviks, not very wisely, had taken that as a signal to use violence to take power. And this backfired on them. And in point of fact, Lenin had to flee the country. He had to flee to Finland, I believe. And Trotsky, I think, was arrested, if memory serves. As I said, it's not very important. What's important is we're trying to get the shape of things. See, there was the February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar. The provisional governments, where the situation deteriorated and sort of like, in terms of peak chaos, hit around July. And then things seemed to simmer down, but the Bolsheviks, when they returned following the summer and into the fall, they quickly attached themselves to the Soviets because they were very good speakers, very dynamic and fiery speakers, and they were very keen to create these military revolutionary committees attached to the Soviets, tasked with protecting the Soviets. And it was that mechanism that they used to ultimately take power. Trotsky himself said about the October Revolution, he said that it wasn't a revolution, it was a coup d'etat, and he said that they didn't take power, that power was just lying on the streets. Now, this is very true, and I'll explain why. What had happened was the provisional governments of Russia, the 4 of them that had occurred between February and October of 1917, well, the first 2 of Prince Lvov, who had been, as I said, a constitutional Democrat, called a cadet, that was the name of those people. The term cadet came from the letters Ka-det, which are the Cyrillic letters of constitutional Democrats. Well, the cadets and Prince Lvov, they had, because the Tsar had always held power, a lot of political parties had emerged, but they didn't know how to actually wield political power. It was sort of like, imagine a teenager who's learned to drive a car in theory, but has never actually sat in the driver's seat with the wheel in front of him and the pedals at his feet. He knows everything in theory, but doesn't know anything about it in practice. And that's what happened with the cadets. That they, since the Tsar's regime had not allowed even a little bit of political power to any kind of political party or anything like that, the cadets didn't really know how to exercise any kind of power, and they were ineffective, if not to say incompetent, in the exercise of power. And so in July, Prince Lvov, who had led the first 2 provisional governments between February and July of 1917, well, he resigned and absconded from the field. Yes, that's right. Alexander Kerensky, who had been this very young, very charismatic, dynamic young socialist, a part of the cabinet of the provisional governments from the start. He was the Minister of Justice, I believe, in the first cabinet. Well, he emerged as the leader of the third and fourth provisional governments. And what happened was that, see, again, there was a lack of political experience and a lack of political ruthlessness that the Bolsheviks had that ruthlessness. And so what happened was that the provisional governments, they slowly but surely deteriorated and lost the support of every other sector of society. And so you have the provisional governments who are nominally in charge of Russia, but Kerensky at the head of this, he can't really get anybody to do anything for him, and he doesn't really have even control of the military. They don't respect him enough or fear him enough to actually follow his orders, and therefore, you know, there's a sense of paralysis in the country, a sense of political paralysis, and there wasn't one event, there wasn't like one moment that sort of like sparked the October Revolution, because the February Revolution, as I said at the very beginning of this rant, I suppose, I hope I'm not boring you all, but in the February Revolution, the spark had been the Women's Day March, because in Russia every year and in all of Eastern Europe, Women's Day is a big deal. And it's a big deal on a national level and on a personal level. I mean, if you've ever been to Eastern Europe, you are expected to give flowers to the woman of the house or the matriarch of the house, and even the young girls of the house. It's a big deal. It's a day where women's work and sacrifice is recognized both on a personal level and on a national level. And there are parades and what have you. And because of the Women's Day marches of 1917, where the grievances, especially about the continuation of this war, the First World War, that seemed to never end, that had been the spark that led to the fall of the Tsar. But in October, there wasn't anything other than the creation of the military revolutionary committees, because the idea was floated by Lenin and tried to be implemented, but it was finally implemented, I want to say late in October of 1917. I mean, it must have been, I don't know, a couple of weeks before the end of the month or something like that. And within a week, the military revolutionary committees essentially staged the coup. So it's very clear, and there's some dispute as to whether Lenin and Trotsky from the very get-go wanted to use the military revolutionary committees to stage the coup or not. It doesn't really matter at this point. What happened was that within a week of them being approved and implemented by the Soviets as the guardians of the Soviets, the military revolutionary committees controlled by the Bolsheviks, who of course did not have that many seats in the Soviets, but since they were the quote-unquote the bodyguards, like think of them as the Praetorian guards of the Soviets, well, they took over. They became the de facto power because they had the power of the gun, you see? Because the Bolsheviks, they never won an election. They never had a majority ever in anything that they've ever done. They never participated in, insofar as Russia was concerned. They always got power by way of the gun, and they were always positioning themselves to both have their hand on the gun and also have a way to, for all intents and purposes, hold the democratically elected representatives hostage to their whims, because that's what happened. The military revolutionary committees became the jailers of the Soviets, and by intimidation, they expunged every opponent of the Bolsheviks from the Soviets and put Bolshevik people in their place, and that's how they created a Bolshevik Soviet in Petrograd and Moscow. And of course, this sparked the Civil War that would last from 1917 until what? Until 1924. And so anyway, that is a basic, simple preface of the events of 1917. I'm sorry if I've gone on. I realize I've gone on for quite a bit. I hope this has been helpful.
Really good. It's really good. Now, Keith, why don't you explain a little bit the Marxist background, the how, and the personality of Lenin? Like, you know, the dispute between Lenin and Bernstein over reform and revolution. how Marxism evolved and the personality of Lenin and things like that.
Yes, that was a very good introduction to the actual political intricacies of the Russian Revolution. And I tend to know less about that, and I know more about the intellectual history that's associated with the Russian Revolution and the backstory to this. But what happened in Russia was very similar, and what happened to Russia in the 19th century was very similar to what had happened to France in the 18th century, in the sense that you had a growing intellectual culture of they wouldn't have really had a middle class the way we think of the middle class, but what would have been the equivalent of the middle class, which was people that are outside the traditional elite, but are still occupy a fairly high status in society. You had a growing middle class intellectual culture that was very rich in many ways in terms of philosophy and art and literature and music and things like that. You had that in France in the 18th century. You had that in Russia in the 19th century. And of course, with Russia, that's how we got Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and all of the other parts of 19th century Russian intellectual culture. But what happened in both circumstances was you had this rising middle class that was very intellectually astute and so forth in many ways, but this was in a context of a political system that allowed for no popular participation in government whatsoever. You had a political system that was very intransient and very uninterested in reform of any kind. You had that in France in the 18th century and again in Russia in the 19th and early 20th century. So what happened is that the reformers, the dissidents, the radicals tended to develop more and more extreme points of view to where the idea was that reform is impossible, so we're going to have to do it by force or through terrorism or through a revolution or something of that nature. In the 19th century in Russia, you had a wave of radical movements that developed. These were basically populist movements, and they had different philosophical leanings. But one of the things they were known for was terrorism, that is, bombings and assassinations and things like that. This was long before the Russian Revolution, decades before that. But this culture, this political culture, this radical political culture developed in Russia in the 19th century that was always oriented towards revolutionism, towards terrorism, towards extremism. That didn't start with the Bolsheviks. Now, not all of this was specifically Marxist oriented, but in the 19th century, of course, Marx developed the theoretical foundation for socialism, for what he called scientific socialism. And for a lot of the time in the growth of the international labor movement and the growth of the socialist movement, Marxism was kind of a fringe perspective. It was actually the anarchists who were more popular in the 19th century than the Marxists, as well as just the socialists generally. That is, people that labeled themselves socialists, social democrats, social revolutionaries. You had parties and organizations calling themselves all kinds of things. But Marxism was initially a fairly fringe movement. Now, Marxism came out of the tradition that emerged from the French Revolution known as Jacobinism. In the French Revolution, you had a group called the Jacobins, and they advocated the seizure of power by force, but essentially through a coup. And also, you had within the French radical tradition, you had the beginnings of early socialism. In particular, there was a brand of socialism known as Blanchism, led by a fellow named Louis Blanc. And this was a brand of socialism that advocated seizing control of the state through conspiratorial means and essentially setting up what amounted to a socialist dictatorship. You achieve socialism through violent revolution and dictatorship. This is Louis Blanc. This comes out of France. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, when they first met, when they were young, in their 20s, they belonged to a group called the Jacobin Club, which was a group that was very influenced by the French Jacobins and advocated for revolution pretty much on the same model as the French revolutionaries. And this is really how the beginnings of Marxism, this is really how Marxism starts. Marx and Engels were young neo-Jacobins They were also influenced by the thinking of Louis Blanc and other French socialists, as well as British liberals and like David Ricardo and some of those in terms of economic theory. But Marxism, in my view at least, has a lot more in common with the French revolutionary tradition than it does English liberalism. And in many ways, it's a repudiation of liberalism. But the Marxism essentially took the Jacobin model of revolution and the Blancist model of socialism and gave it this very elaborate theoretical apparatus that's almost like a theological system. I mean, if you really delve into Marxism, it's got this, very elaborate, detailed philosophical framework, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, all of this kind of stuff. And a lot of that is borrowed from other thinkers. I mean, some of it is borrowed from Louis Andreas von Feuerbach. Some of it is borrowed from the French socialists. Some of it is borrowed from the English liberal, it's like the Ricardo, as far as some of the economic stuff, and Hegel and a number of other people. But that was really the contribution of Marxism to socialism, that it gave it this very elaborate theoretical framework that purported to be a scientific theory. Now, it was also true that Marxism continued to be on the fringe of the European left into the 19th century. It was always sort of a marginal movement. It appealed primarily to intellectuals. As the labor movement grew, as the populist and socialist-oriented popular movements grew, Marxism continued to be on the fringe. It was, again, it appealed to intellectuals, but a lot of people didn't understand it. It was and it wasn't really a central thrust of European radicalism in the 19th century. Where Lenin comes into the picture is that Lenin was a Russian. He was from the nobility. He wasn't from the upper strata of the nobility, but he was, I guess, from the equivalent of the upper middle class. When he was younger, his older brother, had been involved in radical activities, including terrorism and things like that. Including a plot against the Tsar to assassinate the Tsar at one point, for which he was executed. Lenin's brother was executed when Lenin was young. Lenin himself became a radical. He initially was a lawyer in Russia, but he also became a very strong adherent of Marxist intellectual theory, which was something that was imported into Russia from Europe. In fact, it's interesting because the Tsarist regime was very censorious. I mean, they didn't have anything like freedom of the press or speech or anything like that. And any foreign books that were imported into Russia or translated into Russian had to meet the approval of the Tsar's censors. And ironically, Marx's Das Kapital passed the watch of the censors because the censors couldn't make any sense of it when they read it. They thought it was just gibberish, so they let it pass. But Lenin became a very devout Marxist. And Lenin took Marxist theory and innovated it a bit, or at least altered it a bit, in the sense that, according to orthodox Marxism, socialist revolution can only occur in an advanced industrial society. Marx would have thought the idea of a socialist revolution in Russia was ridiculous because, as the previous speaker said, there was almost no industry in Russia. I mean, Russia was an agricultural society of small towns, as was said earlier. Marx thought that the first socialist countries would be the most advanced industrial countries. Marx thought socialism would come first to England, America, France, Germany, Holland, those countries, particularly England and America, the ones that were the furthest along in the industrial process. And he believed that this was a law of history. He believed he had discovered a law of history that predetermined this. Now, Lenin argued that socialist revolution, was not something that the working class itself would make happen. Now, that's an inversion of our orthodox or of Marxist theory itself, because Marx himself believed, there's a quote from Marx, "The emancipation of the working class must be the class-conscious act of the working class itself." And what that meant is that Marx thought that the workers would naturally arise in revolt against capitalism due to their own exploitation. He thought this was something that would be inevitable. The workers would be so impoverished, so oppressed, they would just revolt, and they would eventually overthrow capitalism and create socialism. this would only happen in advanced industrial countries. It wouldn't happen in agricultural societies. Lenin said, no, it's not going to happen that way. And Lenin believed that workers lacked the education and experience and knowledge and all the things that they needed to be good socialist or Marxist revolutionaries. Lenin said that workers by themselves have no capacities other than to rise above trade union consciousness, what he called trade union consciousness. That is the idea that, yeah, workers will go out and join unions to strike for better pay or something like that, but they don't really understand socialism. They don't understand capitalism. They don't understand why they're being oppressed by capitalism. They're not intellectuals. They don't care about theory and history and historical materialism and all of that. So Lenin's idea was that there had to be a revolutionary vanguard. That is, there had to be an elite core of professional revolutionaries whose purpose was to educate and guide the working class towards revolutionary struggle. You had to have, essentially these were like Marxist missionaries. They're out there trying to convert the working class to socialist philosophy and ideology, and they needed this elite core, this vanguard of socialist revolutionaries to lead them towards socialism. That's Lenin's innovation, the idea of the vanguard. And he believed that the vanguard is a core, as I said, of professional revolutionaries who have their own vanguard party, what they call the vanguard party, which is the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. And their goal is to act as a force in history on behalf of the proletariat, to lead the proletariat towards socialism. So that's one aspect of that Lenin introduced. Also, Lenin believed that reforms were not possible. That one of the core Marxist ideas is that there can be no reconciliation between labor and capital. That reformism is a waste of time. That capitalism needs to be overthrown, and that the proletariat shouldn't settle for anything less. And the capitalists are not going to go for any reforms anyway, so reformism is a waste of time. To achieve socialism, you have to do it by violent revolution. That's a core Bolshevik Leninist idea. Now, around this time, there was a break in the international socialist movement in Europe between those who had views like Lenin and those who had followed the ideas of Bernstein, a guy named Edward Bernstein. Bernstein was a German socialist who believed that reformism was the route to go. By this time, European societies were becoming increasingly liberal. More democratic type reforms were starting to be introduced. Constitutionally protected rights of citizens were starting to be introduced. Things like that. More and more restrictions on labor unions and opposition parties and the opposition press were being lifted. And Bernstein said, look, we can reform capitalism within the context of a democracy, a democratic state. We need to work to create a democratic state in which we can reform capitalism as well through things like more rights for workers and trade unions and labor parties and all the different kinds of things like that. So this really was a big split in the Marxist movement or in the socialist movement between predominantly Western socialists who wanted to pursue a more reformist route, and those, particularly in Russia, who wanted to have a more revolutionary route. And the legacy of Bernstein is in part represented by groups like the German Social Democratic Party. And again, today in a lot of the European countries, you have social democratic and labor parties that are very still influential. And really, they're an outgrowth of this idea, the idea of reforming capitalism through democratic practice and labor parties and all of that. Now, Leninism tended to be more popular in the East. It was considered, Leninism in its time, Bolshevism, was considered by many in the international socialist movement and in the international labor movement to be an extremist point of view. The previous speaker mentioned how in Russia, the Bolsheviks were thought of as these crazy radicals, and they were viewed that way among the international workers movement as well. They were thought as being kind of out on the fringes. For one thing, their authoritarianism was widely disdained. Most of the parties and organizations and movements in the workers movement wanted to have a democracy, a democratic system of government. Um, the Leninist tendencies were more influenced by the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins, and by early socialists like Louis Blanc that advocated socialist dictatorships and things like that. And that's really what Leninism comes out of as well. And Marxism was very heavily influenced by that tradition, and so was Leninism. Lenin was largely put in a situation in Russia where he ended up gaining power by circumstances. It was it was previously said that one of the Bolshevik leaders said that we didn't take power; it was just laying in the street, and that really is true. That really is what happened. It was just the right combination of circumstances in the sense that the czars fell. They had this series of provisional governments that weren't very effective. There were efforts to turn power over to these councils, and those were very ineffective, but they were also easily manipulated. And as was previously said, the Bolsheviks managed to get control of the Red Army, the Revolutionary Army. And as Mao Zedong said, all political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That's ultimately how the Bolsheviks got power in Russia. I mean, they were widely considered in their time to be traitors. A lot of people in the international workers movement or the socialist movement considered them to be traitors for having set up a dictatorship and having suppressed their rivals. Of course, there were other people who flocked to their ranks after they took power in Russia because they were seen as an example of those that had actually carried out a successful socialist revolution. And this was actually a big source of a split in the radical movement in Europe and elsewhere. So that's really the intellectual history, I think, of how all this came into being, of how the Russian Revolution came into being. In Marxist theory, there's this concept called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's often been debated among Marxists and other intellectual historians about what the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was supposed to be. There are some who argue that it doesn't necessarily imply a dictatorship in the same sense that we think of a dictatorship today, that is a strongman rule, one-party state, that kind of thing. Instead, it was intended to be a class dictatorship where you have class rule. Marx never said much about what the ideal socialist state would look like or anything like that in terms of structures, laws, and the reason why is he didn't really think it was very important. For Marx, everything was about class power. What matters is what class has power, and the goal is to, if you're a Marxist, is to replace the rule of the capitalist class with the rule of the working class. And that in turn forms the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, the proletariat, the working class, is the ruling class at that point. Now, Lenin modified the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat to where, again, he had this idea of the vanguard party. So you have the Workers' Party, the vanguard party, the Communist Party, that is led by a core of professional revolutionaries who are enlightened by ideology and by theory, by Marxist theory, and then they are the guides of the working class. They're steering the working class towards socialism. But because the workers can't achieve anything beyond trade union consciousness, you need this revolutionary party that acts on behalf of the working class and then takes control of the state in the name of the working class, and then sets up a dictatorship of the proletariat. That is a one-party dictatorial state that acts and rules in the name of the working class. And it's interesting to see how all of the communist states in the 20th century would call themselves the People's Democratic something or other. Even the North Koreans, for example, they're called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Even Pol Pot in Cambodia, that was called Democratic Kampuchea. And when they say democratic, they mean democratic in the sense of class rule, democratic in the sense of popular rule through the people state, with this elite class of professional revolutionaries acting in the name of the people and a people's party that they control. That's basic Leninist theory. It was something that was copied by Maoism, by Kimism, by Hoism, by Castroism, by Pol Potism, by Robert Mugabeism. This really set the model for the 20th century totalitarian revolutionaries. And not just communist revolutionaries either. I would argue that the Nazi revolutionary in Germany in 1932 was very heavily influenced by this model. Nazism is very similar to Leninism in the sense that you have this idea that you have a revolutionary party. The party is the representative of the people's will, with the people being the Aryan race rather than the working class, but it's conceptually similar in terms of its political application. And in Nazism, you have the idea of the Führer, the leader, who speaks for the people. You have the Führer's party, who is the people's party. The Revolutionary Party takes power. It sets up a people state, an Aryan state that rules in the name of the people. Therefore, this is a real democracy. If you go back and watch some of Hitler's old speeches and read the transcripts of his old speeches, he actually said stuff like that. He would often speak in very egalitarian terms. This is the people's state. I'm just an expression of the people's will. We're breaking down rank and hierarchy and social distinction and things like that. So this idea of the cult of the party, the cult of the leader, all of that, I think, has its root in Bolshevism, as well as in fascism. And in fact, there's an interesting relationship between Leninism and fascism. Mussolini was at one point the leader of the socialist movement in Italy. And Lenin said at one point that if there was a socialist revolution in Italy, that Mussolini should rightfully be the head of state, the head of a socialist Italian state, because he at one point was the most prominent socialist leader. Now, I don't agree that fascist ideology is the same thing as socialism. There are some people, there are some traditional conservatives and libertarians who argue that fascism is really just a form of leftist heresy that's really no different than Leninism or communism. Is just a variation of it. I think in some ways it's a repudiation of socialism, although it keeps certain other features of modernism and futurism and all of that. But that's a separate discussion. But I think the important thing about the Russian Revolution, the most important thing is it really was the prototype for all of the 20th century totalitarian revolutions. It really was the prototype for the fascist revolution in Italy, the Nazi revolution in Germany, the communist revolution in Korea under Kim Il-sung in 1948, the communist revolution under Mao in China a year later, all the revolutions and communist revolutions in Southeast Asia in the 70s and in the third world in the post-colonial period. I mean, all of that was, there were dozens of these revolutions that were modeled on the Bolshevik Revolution, and they really set the model for what a revolution amounted to in the 20th century.
Yeah, there's a lot to work with here, but I think one thing that it's a little odd to start at this point in the game, but Russia, as it was before the revolution, it needs to be explained that the Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for largely 300 years up to this point, and it was essentially a one-party state. It had an absolute monarch who had the support of the church and the nobility. There was no practical limitation on the monarch's power. There was no parliament in say, the 1890s. There was no constitution. He could pretty much do whatever he wanted. The Tsar saw Russia as a whole as his own sort of private fiefdom, his own personal property. And we see that there were really essentially two classes in Russia prior to industrialization. Once we industrialize, we get the small proletariat. We have about, as Coach Redpill said, about 90% of the country is peasant. And the peasants are organized in peasant communes, where they have peasant communes. And I think it's that the organization is Zemstvo, where they have these popular assemblies and make decisions within these communes. And then there's the boyars, which are the nobility. And the boyars' power had already been broken centuries earlier, and they were loyal supporters of the Tsar. And so really nobody owned anything except the Tsar. And so once these people are given the authority to manage things, they have no experience in managing anything. As the Apostle Paul says, how can you manage the church if you can't manage your own household? Well, in many ways, the Russians weren't given a chance to even do that up until they were given power. Now, as Russia learned from its defeat in the Crimean War, it needed to industrialize. The French and the British were far way more advanced than the Russians, and they suffered crushing defeats in the Crimean War. And so they decided to industrialize. And they realized that also implied an educated, literate population. Now, this led to the rise of the intelligentsia, who saw how the West was more open, more democratic, more capitalistic, and more equal. And so they began to follow two routes, sort of a liberal reformist route and a sort of more radical Jacobin route. And what ends up happening is that during the Russo-Japanese War, Russia, which was unpopular with the intelligentsia, was a massive disaster. The Russians are hundreds of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of men, and they have a revolution on their hands in 1905. Now, the way they get around that is basically the Tsar promises to have a Duma, an elected parliamentary system. Now, between 1905 and 1917, the Duma and the Tsar have a very difficult relationship. The Tsar doesn't want to give up power, so he tends to be somewhat authoritarian, using his prerogative to close down the Duma. And the Duma tends to want to have reforms quickly, so they'll abuse their prerogatives as well to shut down the Tsar. And all throughout this period, beginning with the
Todd, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut it short because I have something here that I have to take care of. So I wish I could stay, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to decamp right now. But I just wanted to thank Keith for that really, really good discussion of the intellectual background of communism, and to you, Todd, for this opportunity to talk about this. And I do hope that we can do this again. And I'm so sorry that I have to go, but unfortunately, its circumstances here prevent me from continuing. Okay?
Okay. Well, thank you for joining anyhow, Coach. It was a really good
my pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you both again. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. But back to where I left off, the Russo-Japanese War was a disaster for the Russian government, and they had to give power to the Duma. Now, beginning with the assassination of Alexander II, the sort of incompetence that we mentioned earlier, the inability to manage politics, was pretty well known. It was easily observable. Alexander III was a tyrant and a despot who ruled with the more traditional iron fist of the Tsar that kept things together. His son Nicholas was completely incompetent for managing the affairs of state. He was a very loving father, affectionate husband. It was really the model family, the sort of model bourgeois Victorian family that we imagine from these novels. He just was not gifted with executive leadership abilities. And he would often make appointees based on personal favors or the opinions of his wife, which were not based on talent, but on connections. And after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, we had one bright spot. We had Stolypin, the great reformer who passed many reforms in Russia in order to help bring it to the modern age. She realized correctly, like Aristotle realized millennia ago, that a free society is based on a strong middle class. And he instituted a series of policies, but modeled around the peasants' land bank, where land would be bought from the boyars and the Tsar and redistributed to the peasants so they could learn how to manage their own property. And this is the origin of where the kulaks come from, which Stalin will then persecute to oblivion in the 1930s. Now, unfortunately, Stolypin was assassinated by disgruntled revolutionaries. But by 1914, 90% of the land in European Russia, was either owned or rented by the peasants. They had had a very long time to take advantage of this. Now, in World War I, when the Russians get involved, it's a disaster. One defeat after another at the hands of the Germans. They may be able to defeat the Turks and the Austrians, but against the Germans, where the main fighting takes place, they are utterly inadequate. Oftentimes, Russian soldiers weren't even equipped with enough ammunition or rifles to fight the Germans. They have to pick up rifles from a soldier that died in front of them. And this led to a great demoralization of the army. In 1916, when the Tsar became head of the army, became chief of staff, every defeat was blamed on the Tsar. Because not only was the Tsar the head of the government, the Tsar was also the head of the army, which is a tremendous loss of the Tsar's credibility. And what people don't understand today is the Tsar was a semi-divine figure. The Tsar was really, there was God, and then there was the Tsar, and then there was everybody else. He had more in common with the Son of Heaven in China, or the sort of King of Kings we find in the Persian kingdoms. And for him to lose so much face, because remember, a king was supposed to be a warrior. The king would lead his nation in battle. This goes back to ancient times, which is in fact why the Israelites wanted to have a king, someone to lead them physically in battle. And the Tsar completely botched it. He had advisors telling him, don't become head of the army. The defeats will be blamed on you, as they correctly understood. And so what we see is a regime that is corrupt, a regime that is calcified, very rigid, and as we saw with its inability to respond to these revolutionary activities, a strong confirmation of the theories of F.A. Hayek and the problem of information. Centralized institutions are not able to quickly and adequately react to situations. So we also see that when the Bolsheviks took over, they had to step into the shoes of the Tsar. For instance, the idea was that when a saint would die in pre-communist Russia, they would be preserved, supernaturally. And when the Bolsheviks dug up the tombs, they found them to be full of either frauds or corpses. But Lenin was entombed and embalmed in order to fill that void of the Russian soul. That Lenin was a holy man. His body was not corrupted. And in many ways, this autocratic culture left a nation unprepared to run its own affairs, which laid the foundation, of course, for Bolshevik tyranny. I think one of the important things to take away from the Bolshevik Revolution is the dangers of intellectuals, the dangers of people that want to remake the world in their own image. Now, Richard Pipes points out that the Bolsheviks believed that man was a tabula rasa. Man had no innate nature and could be molded to fit any shape that they wanted. And they believed that man was a machine, purely a biological machine. And those two things coupled together, well, if it's a machine with enough input-outputs, you'll be able to get it to be whatever you want. We know that humans are not as simple as was once thought by late Enlightenment thought, but those two beliefs, coupled with a kind of post-Christian messianism, gave the impetus to Bolshevism and future communist revolutions throughout the world. And it's quite interesting that, for instance, Kerensky was completely incompetent. The Kornilov affair, which what precipitated the July days, was in all likelihood a farce. He wanted to solidify his own power, and so he sent a warning to Kornilov that the Bolsheviks were mobilizing, and that he should suppress the Bolsheviks in Petrograd, when there was no Bolshevik rising at all. And what happened was Kornilov comes to attack, and then he's stopped by Kerensky. But Kerensky's afraid of Kornilov, so he then arms the Bolsheviks, who he failed to crush in the July days. And doing that, he then offends the army. So when he needs them in the October Revolution, the army just stands by. He's like, hey, you screwed us over with Kornilov. We're not really interested anymore. And furthermore, his previous ignorance of the will of the people when his Kerensky offensive. That was the straw that broke the camel's back for the provisional government, because they promised, they'll get out of the war. This is, we're going to be a democratic society. And yet most of the people were tired of the war. And what does Kerensky do? He launches another massive offensive, which is a tremendous disaster. The Russians lose hundreds of thousands of men. And at this point, it's at boiling point. So Keith, what do you think about some of the legacies, the pernicious legacies of the Bolshevik Revolution?
Well, as I said earlier, it was largely the prototype for the many totalitarian revolutions that happened in the 20th century. At one point in the 20th century, like in the late 70s, early 80s, about 2/3 of the world's governments were one-party totalitarian states, and they controlled about 50% of the world's population. And that was the Soviet Union, which was present-day Russia, plus all of the former Soviet republics, predominantly in Central Asia. There were about 15 of those. Plus, there were the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. I think there were 7 of those. Plus, there was the communist regime in Yugoslavia that was formed by Marshal Tito in the 1940s. And then there was, of course, Maoist China and North Korea, and then all of the totalitarian communist regimes that came out of the aftermath of the Vietnam War in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Of course, there was Cuba, Castro's Cuba, And then there was Yemen. At one point, Yemen was split into two countries, one of which was a Marxist-Leninist, largely a Soviet puppet state. You also had a number of communist revolutions in Africa in the 60s and 70s in places like Ethiopia, the Congo, Mozambique, Angola, a number of other places. And even in countries where you didn't have communist revolutions, you had communist insurgents and terrorist groups that killed a lot of people, like the Shining Path in Peru was one good example from the 1980s. You had other groups like that in Africa. At one point, you had an international network of Soviet satellite parties, even in democratic countries, some of which were very influential. In the 60s and 70s, the communist parties of Italy and France were very influential. France, at one point, in French elections in the late 60s, the communists would get as much as 25% of the vote. So the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution was the worldwide communist movement, which was a worldwide movement to create one party, largely one man, or at least one figurehead man, dictatorships, which totally suppressed civil society. They believed their ideology believed that for a socialist revolution to happen, society had to be totally remade. It wasn't just enough to have a change in political power. You had to totally remake the society. So you had to totally not only restructure the economy along socialist lines, but you had to eradicate elements of the old traditional or bourgeois or feudal or whatever culture. That meant traditional family relations, traditional religion, traditional popular culture, all of these kinds of things. Everything had to be remade in the image of what the ideal socialist or communist society would be. And this was a system that was put into place over and over again in multiple different nations. And as I said, even nations that were not avowedly communist, but that they weren't hammer and sickle nations, even many of those were influenced by this model of revolution, or this kind of model state. Nazi Germany was one, fascist Italy was another, the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was still another. And there were others as well. So the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was the prototype for 20th century totalitarianism. It was the first of the 20th century totalitarian states. Now we can argue it has its roots in older things like the French Revolution, but as far as the 20th century model of what people today think of as a communist or fascist dictatorship, a one-party state with some kind of strongman character as the ruler or head of state, it was Bolshevism that created that model. That model of statecraft originates from Lenin, and it's still something that is influential today. As the first speaker said, while it's certainly true that on the world scene communism has very much faded, there's only a handful of nations that still claim that as their guiding ideology. China being one, although they've liberalized their economy considerably, and then there's a few others, probably North Korea being the most obvious example. It's also true that many people in contemporary times have lost sight of what these kinds of regimes actually were. Nowadays, as the first speaker said, you see these college students wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. Che Guevara was one of the communist leaders of the Cuban Revolution. You see people at left-wing protest demonstrations holding the hammer and sickle flag, the flag of communism. You see people, even in the academic world, in more left-leaning academic curriculums, they actually will study Lenin and Mao and people like that as actual serious thinkers, as opposed to what essentially amounted to cult leaders that became tyrants once they became heads of state. And this, for some reason, communism does not have the level of intellectual and social opprobrium that Nazism and fascism do. I think there's a range of reasons for that, but I think one of the main things is that it's just not emphasized in the press or in the educational system. All of us that live in the modern West, contemporary West, from the time we're young, we see television documentary and movie after movie and TV show after TV show and book after book about the Holocaust, about how evil Nazi Germany was, and all about World War II and the glorious victory over the Axis forces and all of that. But we don't really see that when it comes to communism. We don't really see movies and books and TV shows and university courses and documentaries on the History Channel and all of that about communism and all of the bloodshed that happened under communist regimes. I mean, communist regimes historically throughout the 20th century were just as murderous and violent and dangerous and deadly as fascist dictatorships and as Nazi Germany and as right-wing military dictatorships. And for some reason, though, this is something that is largely swept under the rug. I mean, now certainly there's a lot of people that are aware of this, like myself. I mean, I grew up during the second half of the Cold War. So I'm sure there are plenty of others who do remember this history, but it's not something that's emphasized anymore as anything that was of any historical significance or importance. And it's interesting how this model, how the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, 100 years ago, created the model for 20th century totalitarian regimes, which killed hundreds of millions of people. And now, while those kinds of regimes have largely disappeared, I mean, I think the last I looked, about 60% of the world's nations are now democracies, and about 3/4 of the world's nations are at least semi-democracies. So this model of state is not nearly as common as it once was. But it's also true that a lot of people seem to be losing sight of what the real problems with these systems were. I've seen polls in recent times taken in various countries where you have people, particularly younger people, saying that these kinds of systems are essentially okay, that fascism or communism or Nazism, I don't know about Nazism, but authoritarian or totalitarian regimes are basically acceptable. And that's I think that's because all of this history is not taught. These body counts are not emphasized. All the people that were killed by Maoism, by Stalinism, by Kimism, by Pol Potism. A lot of people have hardly even heard of that stuff nowadays, but everybody's heard of Hitler. Everybody's heard of the Holocaust. So it's I think it's a failure, a colossal failure of the popular culture, of the intellect, of the educational system, not to have made people more aware of these problems.
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly. I think one of the unique features of Bolshevism, which was not necessarily always communicated to its imitators, was this single-minded view that revolutionary justice was the idea that whatever helped advance the perspective of the revolution was just. Whatever hindered it was unjust. I think it was Lev von Mises who once said that the Bolsheviks were the first leaders of a country to abolish justice itself. One of the party members was arguing with Lenin over the title of their essentially terror wing, and Lenin, he said we should call it something to the effect of the arm of revolutionary vengeance. And Lenin's like, you're absolutely right, but we can't call it that. We have to call it the Ministry of Justice, because nobody would take us seriously if we did that. And this kind of really, the closest analog we have to this would be like the Mongols or the Huns, this kind of single-minded inhumanity that where they would apply limitless amounts of violence to achieve their desired goals. It was extremely deleterious not only to the Russian people, but to their neighbors and to other regimes that imitated them. And that seems to be a part of the package of that. The other thing we learned from this Russian experience is that in an autocracy like Russia, whoever controls the military is the one that has true power, right? The Tsar, through throwing away his goodwill during the war, lost control of the military. After the Kornilov affair, Kerensky lost control of the military. And as we would see in 1991, the Bolshevik regime itself lost control of the military. And so what we see in these autocratic regimes is the primacy of the military. And Lenin saw this. Lenin saw the primacy of the use of force and military power to achieve his desires. And that's one of the things that the Tsar didn't see. Previous Tsars had seen it, but not Nicholas. And really almost nobody in the provisional government saw. And that seems to be another problem as well, was that in the center left, provisional government, they tended to view the reactionaries as more of a threat than the far left. So when Kerensky armed the Bolsheviks in order to repel the Kornilov attacks, he just thought, well, Kornilov is more dangerous. He's a counter-revolutionary. He's going to end the revolution. And it's a great failing on the provisional government and the broader Russian left that they failed to see the threat of Bolshevism. I think maybe the only left-wing thinker in Russia that was prominent enough to have warned about this was Bakunin, who warned that if you have state socialism, they're going to beat the people with the people's stick. And if only they had taken that to heart, maybe the likes of the left SRs or Kerensky could have been a little more prudent, and the fights that they picked and the people that they armed. Ultimately, their failure to be prudent or having adequate foresight led to a tremendous human disaster for not just Russia, but largely the world. And one thinks that Bolshevism and communism is really passé now, and suppose it is in those areas of the world where they formerly occupied. But right now, though, we see a resurgence in universities and in academia in the West, where Bolshevism is romanticized constantly. And we without sounding hysterical, we begin to see the kind of attitudes of an intelligentsia that could become Bolshevik itself, much the way we saw in the 20 years leading up to the October Revolution.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things to that. You mentioned how in communist theory you have this idea of revolutionary justice, where justice is defined by the position that someone has in the social class hierarchy. And that is precisely the perspective that these people that are commonly called social justice warriors promote today. If you listen to their rhetoric and read their literature, the implicit assumption in their whole ideology is that anything that is perceived to be favorable to the so-called oppressed is by definition justifiable and acceptable, whereas anything that is perceived to be advantageous to the oppressor class or the privileged class or whatever is by definition illegitimate or unjustifiable. For instance, among these people, if there's they're not particularly labor or class oriented anymore, but their inclination would be, let's say if there's a worker strike, they would always assume that the workers are right no matter what because they're the workers. So of course, if they're striking, it must be justifiable. Or they'll assume that something like affirmative action, which is intended to compensate minorities for past discrimination, they will assume by definition that affirmative action is something that's desirable, productive, produces positive results, is justifiable, irrespective of any empirical evidence one way or the other. And they'll say the same thing about other things. I've noticed when it comes to the feminists who discuss rape culture, they have this. They essentially argue that jurisprudence should be rewritten, where the idea of innocent until proven guilty is essentially eliminated when it comes to rape cases. Instead, it should be the burden of the accused to claim they were who would be considered guilty until proven innocent. And the same thing is true with all the other, causes of liberation or anti-oppression or whatever that you see among the social justice warrior types. You see this idea, that, for example, when it comes to gay rights, they would argue that gays are by definition an oppressed class, and therefore anything that gays want should be given to them because otherwise you're oppressing them. And it doesn't matter whether other people's rights figure into the equation or not. That is the associational or economic or religious or privacy or whatever kind of rights of other people. And the groups like the Antifa and some of these neo-communist groups take it a step further because they actually do advocate the use of violence in the name of liberation. And that is, if you read the writings of the Antifa, theorists and just the propaganda and rhetoric, they essentially demand for themselves to declare the right to declare anyone they disagree with to be a fascist. And that by definition means that any kind of violence you use against someone who is considered to be a fascist is justifiable. And of course, we've seen that they don't just consider, actual ideological fascists to be fascists. They consider moderate Republicans to be fascists. They consider mainstream conservatives to be fascists. They consider a lot of rival leftists to be fascist, and they assume that they're justified in using violence against political opponents because they're fighting, genocide or oppression or whatever. I've seen this among anarchists. I've seen rival anarchists call each other fascists and use violence against each other over that. And there, the implicit in that, though, is that someone is guilty of some kind of crime that just by having put this label on them, and that's something that was commonly practiced by the Bolsheviks and then later by Stalinist regimes as well. So this kind of stuff is making a big comeback today, only in a different form. I mean, it doesn't even matter whether groups like the social justice warriors or the Antifa actually fly hammer and sickle flags or not. I mean, they act or call themselves communists. I mean, some of them do and some of them don't. But what's more important is the mentality, the psychology, and the way that they see the world. And it's precisely the exact same ideological system. Even with the so-called anti-fascist, a lot of people today, now that the Antifa has started to get more publicity in the mainstream, a lot of people probably have no idea that the group that was trying to stage a rally on November 4th, Refuse Fascism, most people probably have no idea that Refuse Fascism is an actual front for the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a hardline Maoist group. Or Yvette Falarka, who leads the BAM, By Any Means Necessary group in California, who's been in the press a lot as an Antifa leader, that most people probably have no idea that BAM is actually a front for the Workers' League, which is a Trotskyite group. Or another prominent Antifa group is Rose City Antifa in Portland, which is a Maoist group. I'm told that the local Antifa group in the area where I live is also a Maoist group. So that's where all of these people are today. I mean, the kind of, the people that we see on TV today, beating up center-right protesters in the park or something, are precisely the same kinds of personalities and psychological types that brought about the totalitarian revolutions of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, well, actually, we're nearing the end of the time allotted. Is there anything you'd want to end with, Keith?
Just that I think it's unfortunate, as I said earlier, that these kinds of things are not recognized for what they are. I'll repeat that this is a failure of the educational system. This is a failure of the popular culture and the mass media, that so few people today who are not old enough to remember the Cold War do not understand what Bolshevism really was, or do not understand what communism really was. For some reason, it's become almost cool to be a commie, particularly among university students. I mentioned the Che Guevara T-shirts at one point. I mean, if you saw students on college campuses walking around wearing T-shirts with swastikas and pictures of Adolf Hitler, portraying him in a positive light, or the fasciste, the symbol of fascist Italy, or T-shirts with Mussolini or Francisco Franco or Ron Perón or someone like that. I mean, somebody like that would probably get beaten up, but somehow it's considered cool to wear a shirt with a hammer and sickle, or a picture of Che Guevara or Lenin or Mao or someone like that. And again, I think this is a real failure of the educational system, that people are not aware of what these systems actually were.
Exactly. This reminds us of the statement by George Santa Anna: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But thanks for coming on, Keith, and even though he's now absent, thanks Coach Redpill for coming on as well. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.